Welcome back to our neurophysiology. So let's continue with the motor control, specifically with the skeletal movement. So the way we did with the basal ganglia. So today we'll be shifting our focus to the brainstem, a major chunk, of course, being the cerebellum. Much focus will be directed to mainly the anatomy, the neuronal connection, and also the functional area of the cerebellum, and of course how it's important in modulating the skeletal movement. It consists of three parts. So this is the medulla, pons, and the mesencephalon. So a mesencephalon can also be regarded as the midbrain. So it's normally on the upper part, and we have the of course the pons on the middle part, the part that is directly associated to the cerebellum, only that in our model we do not have the cerebellum here. And on the inferior end we have the medulla oblongata that is normally in continuation to the spinal cord. So maybe what we need to remember, the midbrain is a very important part of the brainstem, in that it normally controls eye movement, some auditory, visual processing, and motor control. We'll be able to see why it's very important. This is because the midbrain majorly have this important nuclei that I think maybe we've talked of it, the red nucleus. The pons also very important because it acts as a conduit, or rather as a relay unit between signals from the brain, that is the higher centers of the brain, all the way down to the spinal cord. Of course, they'll need to pass through the pons, and also regulates things like breathing, and plays an important role in sleeping and in motor control, as we'll be able to see. Medulla oblongata also very important in controlling some of the autonomic functions of the body. These include things like heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. So if one was to see actually the spinal, or rather the brainstem, they'll think of it as an upward extension of the spinal cord, so extending into the cranial cavity. Or in another sense, somebody might think of the brainstem as a part of the CNS. That means it's a master on its own, where it is able to conduct these various special functions as we are seeing listed here below. So these are the control of the respiration, control of the cardiovascular system, partial control of the gastrointestinal function. So to an extent, we are able to see some of the reflexes within the GIT being well coordinated in this particular area. Many of the stereotype movements, so movement with no major goals, can also arise from the medulla oblongata. Also controls the equilibrium and also controls the eye movement. So a summary of just how these different parts of the medulla, different parts of the brainstem is likely to work. And also another important thing that you need to realize with the brainstem. So brainstem is also very important in that they normally contain cranial nerves. As you can see, if you are very keen on this, so let us just expand this a little bit. So if you are a little bit keen, you are able to see some labeling. So this labeling representing some of the nuclei or some of the cranial nerves that are normally associated with the brainstem. So I think maybe you can just have a view of it. So for example, if you were to click at number 1, you'll be able to see an optic chiasma that is associated with the optic nerve, so the left and the right. So cranial, not really cranial, but the brainstem also very important in that it contains a main nucleus of the cranial nerve. So if you are to go through these other numbers, you'll be able to see the left oculomotor, you'll be able to see the right oculomotor. So all these are associated with the brainstem. So the brainstem are very important in the very important, and we'll see that it normally works closely with the cerebellum, specifically this particular part where we are having our pontine joining straight to the cerebellum, and also the midbrain getting some of the signals or having some of the neuronal connection to the cerebellum. So it is also good to point that some of the nuclei within the brainstem also serve various or major important function. So we've been able to say that the brainstem will actually act as a conduit or as a way station for the passage of command controls from the higher central of the brain all the way down to the spinal cord. Another important function to the various nuclei that exist within the brainstem, specifically the reticular and the vestibular nuclei. So they normally support the body against the gravity, in that without the impulses generated at this particular area, an individual will not be able to sustain a gravity. They'll just obey the law of gravity, and that is by falling down. So these nucleus are able to send signals that can allow muscles to stand against the ground, so in a way that they are opposing the gravity. So these include the reticular and the vestibular nuclei. So the reticular nuclei are divided into two major parts. So let's again extend to have a view of the same. So the reticular nucleus is divided into various parts. So we suggested that in here being the brainstem, posterior to it, just before posterior to it, in the middle between between the cerebellum and the brainstem, lies the reticular area. But if you go in depth, you'll be able to find the fourth ventricle or even the aqueduct. So we have the pontine reticular area, that which is adjacent to the pontine, and we have the medulla reticular areas. So we've been we are suggesting that they are playing different roles. So the pontine reticular nuclei, so the nuclei at this particular area, are located posteriorly and lateral in the pons, extending to the mesencephalon. Medullary reticular nuclei, which extend through the entire medulla, lying ventrally and medially near the entire nuclei. So we are being told that these are very important area in supporting the body against gravity. So the gravity is normally performed by antagonistic signal from the pontine and medullary reticular. So let's specifically examine the contribution of the cerebellum in the overall motor control. So we saw the role of the basal ganglia, so just as an highlight. So the cerebellum normally plays a major roles in timing the motor activities and in rapid, smooth progression from one muscle to another, muscle movement to the next. It also helps to control the intensity of the muscle contraction when the muscle load changes, and control the necessary interstaneous interplay between agonistic and antagonistic muscle groups. So just as a reminder, the basal ganglia normally help to plan and control complex pattern of muscle movement, controlling relative intensity, as we are able to say, of the separate movements, direction of the movements, and sequences of multiple successive and parallel movements for achieving the specific complicated motor goals. So as you can be able to see, the human cerebellum is normally located at the base of the brain. So you can see the cerebellum over here. At the base of the brain at large, you expect to find the cerebellum somewhere here at the inferior posterior end of the brain. So on top of it lies the cerebrum, a large mass that is the cerebellum, and portion of the brainstem called the pons in front of it. So this is our brainstem. So the portion of the brainstem that is lying or that is closely related to the cerebellum is actually the pons. And then just below the pons you expect now the medulla, and now above the pons we expect some mesencephalon or the midbrain. So normally the cerebellum is separated from the overlying cerebrum by a layer of tough dura mater called the cerebella tentorium, or some of the vaults that we suggested the cerebellum tentorium. So we are just able to see in between the cerebellum, the cerebella and the cerebellum. There should be that gap formed by the invaginating meningeal dura, as we are able to suggest in our introduction. So if you take off the cerebrum, this is what will remain with, representing now the cerebellum. And just like the cerebellum, cerebrum, this cerebellum is also divided into hemisphere. So that is the right and the left. So you are just able to see. So we are having the left and the right. So this is the left and this is the right cerebral hemisphere. So this is divided by a midline narrow zone, actually referred to as the vermis. So I hope you are able to see if you enlarge it a little bit. So we are having two lobes, or rather the two hemisphere of the cerebellum, the left and the right part. In between, the structure that divides them is actually the vermis. And if you take a close examination, you'll notice the way we suggested, anterior to it lies the brainstem. The brainstem, of course, the part which it's attached to directly is now the pons. So this represents the pons, and superior to it represents the mesencephalon, or the midbrain, and now posterior to the inferior to the pons, we have our medulla oblongata. We'll be able to see specifically how these areas associate in terms of neuronal connection, so that we are able to see how the cerebellum actually control the motor or the muscle movement, of course in association with the brainstem, and of course not forgetting the role of the cerebral cortex. So if you are to take our model and divide it into two along the vermis line, so that you get the sagittal view or the mid-sagittal view of it. So this is what we'll expect. So if you look at it, you'll expect the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. This is of course again accessible exteriorly. So if you can focus on our model here, so let's enlarge it a little bit. You focus on the model, you are able to see this is from the posterior view. So remember the way it's normally oriented. So assuming that we are having our cerebellum on top of this, and our brain cerebrum, that is on top of this and extending. So this is the posterior part. So if you have the posterior view of the cerebellum, this is what you'll see. But if you get a midsection sagittal view, you cleave off this part so that you are left with either right or the left hemisphere. This is what you'll be able to see. So we are able to see it is divided into various lobes, major lobes. So we normally have the anterior lobe. The anterior lobe is actually on top. It is anterior because if you are to look at it in a profile view, or let's say in a lateral view, the most anterior in terms of the lobe, this will be the anterior. So this becomes the anterior, and then we are having the posterior lobe. So it might seem as though there are two: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe. Beneath the posterior lobe, you are having the flocculonodular lobe. Visible from this end. The gross anatomy, this can be further subdivided. So we say that we having our anterior lobe. So we can see anterior lobe, both of the right cerebral cerebellar hemisphere and the right cerebellar hemisphere separated by the vermis. If you assume the vermis, you can think of it as an extension, but remember the vermis is in between. So we can actually have some further subdivision when it comes to this. Specifically, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, they are normally divided by some form of fissure. So remember in our cerebellum, we also had some fissures, or what somebody can refer to as the sulci. So we have major fissure that separates the anterior into the posterior. So this referred to as the primary fissure. Divides the anterior lobe from the posterior, so that it seems as though we're having three major lobes. So that is the anterior divided by the vermis, so that we are having for the two sides. We are having now the posterior divided by the vermis, so that we are able to see it from two sides. But what you need to know that the flocculonodular lobe is actually it's actually extended and not actually divided by the vermis. So the vermis terminates at this particular point. So at this place, we expect some form of what we can call the nodule. So we are having some nodule with an extension of the floccular part of the lobe. So the posterior is further subdivided into two. I hope you can be able to see some fissure that is cutting across the posterior lobe. So this is normally regarded as the horizontal fissure. So the horizontal fissure are normally are not really the horizontal. Well, it's the horizontal fissures that separates the superior posterior lobe, the posterior superior lobe from the inferior posterior lobe, and then have the posterolateral fissures that separates the flocculonodular lobe from the posterior lobe, specifically that which is inferior. So we can also have functional classification of anatomical sites. So for example, we can have what we call the vestibulocerebellum area. So this normally consists of the flocculonodular lobe and adjacent vermis. So this regarded to that area. So we can just write the name a little bit. The vestibulocerebellum. So this is an classification of the cerebellum parts according to their functionality, according to their functions, that is. So this normally consists of the vermis adjacent, majorly the flocculonodular lobe. You can see it over here with the adjacent area of the vermis. So the zone can actually be represented as this. That means it serves a very important functions. So as you'll be able to notice, this actually area have a very important kind of nuclei, normally regarded as they normally receive some neuronal signals from the vestibular nuclei that ends into the vestibular apparatus that is normally in this zone. And they also normally receive some visual impulse, specifically from the visual cortex of the cerebrum, and of course, as we've suggested, things that signal that comes from the cerebrum before getting into the into our cerebellum, they normally need to pass through the pontine. So they pass through the pontine into the folliculonodular part that has this important part by the name vestibular apparatus, and also it will receive a signal from the superior collicus. So remember, superior collicus and the visual cortex are related to the visual impulse. We also have the spinocerebellum. So let's just write it here. Spinocerebellum as a specific functional zone of the cerebellum. So you can see this, the spinocerebellum. The spinocerebellum actually consists majorly of the vermis. Let's write it here: vermis and the adjacent area of the cerebellar hemisphere. So the lateral of the intermediate area. So this can be regarded as the intermediate zone. So this area can be classified as the spinocerebellum. As the word suggests, it could be very important in controlling in receiving and also modulating signals from the spinal, so that it controls majorly the movement of the limbs. And if it's controlling the movement of the limbs, it is highly likely that it will receive some proprioception signals. This is specifically from the spinocerebellum that we suggested while covering the tracts, or rather the ascending tracts in the spinal cord. So this zone, the spinocerebellum, so they normally receive signal from the spinocerebellar tract from the spinal cord, and these are actually feeding our cerebellum with our proprioception signals. Remember, the proprioception part of the sensation are very important to tell this the cerebellum the information about the length, or rather the contraction and the tension of the muscle, so that when it's giving out some motor signal, it is able to put those sensory signal into consideration. So they also the spinocerebellum also receives signals from the trigeminal and also the auditory. We cannot emphasize enough the role of this in modulating the movement, or rather controlling the movement. From there, after the reception, it normally sends its signal to the cerebellar nucleus. So there are some deep cerebellar nuclei that you anticipate inside this particular area of the brain. So that is normally referred to as the vestigial nuclei. So let's write it down here. So assume that inside, after receiving the signals, so they'll all be integrated as the vestigial nuclei. That is, of course, before the cerebellum decides to release the signals and send it to the appropriate places. From the vestigial nucleus, signals will actually will project from the vestigial nucleus all the way into the cortex. This is because it wants to share some of the proprioception signal with the cortex. So it will reach the cortex using two major pathways. So if we enlarge this a little bit, you are able to see signal moving into the cortex area. So it normally uses the midbrain, so it can decide to use the midbrain. So it can go directly to the midbrain, or sometimes it might bypass the midbrain onto the thalamus. We said, or rather we suggested, that the thalamus is normally at the gate point to the cerebral cortex. So for signals to reach the cerebral cortex, they need to pass. So from the vestigial nuclei of the cerebellum, a signal will go through the thalamus using the cerebellothalamus or the cerebellothalamo tract, or it might go to the midbrain. Remember, in the midbrain, our major nucleus over there is the red nucleus. So upon the red nucleus again will sprout out some neurons that connects the red nucleus to the thalamus, so that eventually our motor, or rather the motor area of the brain, is able to also receive some proprioception signal, and this is how they are coordinating with the cerebellum. So this is actually a very important part of the cerebellum. So some signals from the red nucleus, that is from the vestigial nuclei, will definitely descend down to form part of the famous cerebrospinal tract. So while other signals are moving to the cortex via the thalamus and the red nucleus, some signal from the vestigial nuclei will go straight to the pons, and some through the vestibule nuclei of the medulla oblongata. So from there, you anticipate now the famous tracts, the vestibulospinal tract descending down to modulate some of the motor activity, and also the reticulospinal tract descending down the spinal cord. And of course, our other functional part of the cerebellum is known as the we can write here cerebellum part. Others might call it the neocerebellum. Cerebellum. Other might call it the that is the pontiocerebellum. So that is just rather trying to describe the neuronal pathway that is normally involved with this particular region. So as the word suggests, it is actually related to the cerebrum. So that means much of the signals that are ending into this zone are actually emanating from all the way from the cerebral cortex, using the pons, and eventually into the lateral hemisphere. So this is actually regarded as the lateral zone of the hemisphere. So it has a lot of mimicry in comparison to the cerebrum, or to the cerebral cortex, because when you think of the cerebral cortex, especially on the frontal part, you are normally tempted to think of the planning, intelligence, and everything that regards decision making. So as the name suggests, also for this, they'll also be able to perform this almost similar role, only that the type of intelligence that is involved in this particular area, it's an intelligence that has to do a lot with the movement. So this is normally involved in planning a movement, and evaluates the sensory information for actions, and it normally exclusively receives its information from the cortex. So that we generally incorporate the cerebellum in modulating the motor control. So remember what we discussed. So in our let's go back to the cerebral cortex. In our cerebral cortex, we actually had our central sulci. We assume that this is a central sulci, where we have the parietal, and we add the frontal. So the frontal was representing the motor part, Parietral, the somatosensory region. So where we say that the somatosensory region will communicate to the motor part, specifically the premotor and the prefrontal part, and then the premotor either sends signals through the basal ganglia, and then back to the primary motor zone for us to send the motor signal through the spinal, the corticospinal tract. So maybe to incorporate our cerebella. So normally when the somatosensory region of the brain, so let this be the somatosensory. So normally when the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex receive information, so before sending it to the premotor area or the prefrontal area for the decision making, so that it is acted upon eventually by the primary motor cortex, these signals are normally sent to the some of these signals are normally sent to the cerebellum. So let's just represent here our cerebellum like that. So normally sent to the cerebellum, of course, through the pontine into now the cerebellum for processing, and the specific point of processing is actually the lateral zone hemisphere. So that means that the pontine is the connecting point between our cerebellum and the cerebrum. So we are receiving information from the somatosensory area and also information from the premotor cortex. That is before it actually feeds the primary motor area. So signals will go to the pontine. So this is normally regarded as the corticopontine pathway. Corticopontine pathway is very, very important because signals are able to move from the cerebral cortex all the way down to the brainstem, specifically the pontine, where now there'll be another pathway from the pontine into the cerebellum, as the name suggests, the pontocerebellar pathway. So if you are able to see in this animation, so specifically with the red tracts that are sending signal from the cortex going downward, so you can just map your signals moving. So we are having signal from the cortex, so specifically the premotor and also the somatosensory area, sending it straight to the pontine. So just follow the red tract. You're able to see it moving. You're able to see signal moving up to this particular point where we expect to have the pontine. So this is the pontine area of the brainstem. So this being the pontine area, so that means that tract from the cortical area all the way down to the pontine represent the corticopontine. So from this point to the pontine, the information are actually transferred from the pontine or the signal that moves all the way through the pons onto the cerebellum. If you can see it, eventually into the lateral zone of the hemisphere. So this represents our cerebellum area, so that we can have our information being processed at this particular point. And what we've suggested is that this is a very important area for the planning of movements and evaluates sensory information for actions before it is executed. So that means that the cerebellum, the specific part of the cerebellum, that is the lateral zone of the hemisphere, we'll need to evaluate this information that is being received from the cerebellum cortex for evaluation to see whether it's fit. So if the information is fit, as you can be able to see from this particular area, specifically we have a very important nuclei, normally regarded as the dentate nuclei. So if you can see our signal from this area being further spreading, now from the pontine, we had our signal moving straight into the deeper area of the lateral zone of the hemisphere, into a specific area where we can refer to it as the dentate nuclei. From the dentate nuclei, the information will information or impulse will move from this spot directly into the red nucleus of the midbrain. And from the red nucleus of the midbrain. So if the information coming from the cerebella is appropriate, it will be sent via it will be sent to the rest of the body via the rubrospinal tract. Remember the rubrospinal tract emanating from the red nucleus all the way down. But if the information has some errors that maybe might need some form of corrections, this signal will spread from the red nucleus of the midbrain all the way into the thalamus. The specific nuclei of the thalamus that is likely to be used is normally the ventrolateral nuclei of the thalamus, and it will ascend again up. You can be able to see the signals are moving, or rather ascending up all the way to the back to the motor or back to the cerebral cortex, so that at least the information can be reprocessed again before the information again is discharged through the corticopontine tract to the pons, to the cerebellum for the procession. If the information is correct, again using the rubrospinal all the way down to the spinal cord. If it's not correct, it will ascend through the thalamus into the cerebral cortex, of course, for the processing, or maybe we'll want the cerebral now to improve the information before again sending it down. So this is the exact way with which the cerebellum normally associate, or rather coordinates, with the cerebral cortex. So some of the signals from the red nucleus can be reverted again back, even though we do not have a clear demonstration of a path. But let's assume from the red nucleus we are having a path back to the cerebellum, normally using tend to use the inferior olivary nucleus, so that it's we are getting information from the inferior olivary nucleus onto the cerebellum. So from the nucleus, some signals can go back to the cerebellum without necessarily reaching the cerebral cortex. Remember, in the superior most part of this model. Away from the functional anatomy, the cerebellum normally receives continuously updated information about the desired sequence of the muscle contraction from the brain motor control areas, as we've been able to demonstrate. It also receives continuous sensory information from the peripheral parts of the body, giving sequential changes in the status of the part of the body. its position, the rate of the movement, forces acting on it, and so forth. So we also acknowledge that the cerebellum is also an integrative area. So receiving some information from the ears, some information from the visual. We've also been able to demonstrate how it's receiving information from the cerebral cortex, information, of course, from the spinal, using the spinocerebellar tract, so that it's able to integrate all this information, so that by the time it is giving us an appropriate movement or a motor impulse, it will put into consideration all the other aspects of the neuronal impulse that is actually receiving, integrating, so that when it is giving out a motor movement, it is able to give the regard of vision, it's able to give the regard of the balance, so that at the end of the day, we are able to receive a coordinated movement. So what does it actually do? The cerebellum actually compares the actual movement that is depicted by the peripheral sensory feedback information with the movement that is intended from the motor system. So the intention before our cerebral cortex actually fires the informations or fires signal using the corticospinal, it needs to get the approval from the cerebellum. Of course, not the majority, but a significant part of it needs to get an approval, getting this information from here, so that the approval, that means that the cerebellum, what is actually doing is actually comparing this information, so that at the end of the day is just able to release a well integrated information. So if the two do not compare favorably, so the information from the motor part and from these other areas, if they do not compare favorably, then interstaneously, subconscious corrective signals are transmitted back to the motor system, as we've been able to demonstrate. So if the information do not tally, some corrective signals will be sent, of course, using the red nucleus onto the thalamus, and eventually into the motor area of the brain for the correction, so that upon correction, the same sequence will be repeated, and hopefully we'll be having a go-ahead, so that we are able to experience a well-coordinated motor movement. And also maybe good to know, just like the motor and the sensory cortex of the cerebrum, where we have the topographical representation of the body by what we refer to as the sensory homoloncus and the motor homoloncus, the vermis and the intermediate zones of the cerebellum also represents the body in a very topographical manner, so that a specific part of the cerebellum determines the specific activity at a specific part of the body. So that is the spinocerebellum, or others might call it the paleo-cerebellum part of the cerebrum. However, the lateral zone is not represented in a topographical manner. So that means it just integrates information in an wholesome way. So think of it as the intelligent part of the cerebellum. Of course, the function of the cerebellum is based on the connections that it has with various parts of the brain. So we can explore, maybe not really exploring, but appreciating some of the neuronal circuits that exist in the cerebellum. So cerebellum, as we've suggested, it normally receives signals that gets into it, and it can also, or not can, it normally also sprouts out signal to modulate various parts of the brain. So we normally have those that enters through the spinal, or rather through the cerebellum, are normally regarded as the afferent. Those that exist and that exit normally regarded as the efferent. So Afferent signals from the into the cerebellum are normally we can have those that emanates from the brain and those that emanates from the peripheral part. So just by naming, we've discussed our corticopontocerebellar pathway. So that having the corticopontine pathway and the pontocerebellar pathway. So all this pathway, that means information that gets the cerebellum actually emanates from, or rather originates from, the cerebral cortex, and we know where that will end into the dentate nuclei, and majorly focusing on the lateral zone of the cerebellum. We also have an extensive olivocerebellar tract. We said that some signals that normally gets from the cerebellum into the red nucleus can go to the thalamus and eventually into the cerebral cortex, but some might come back using the olivo or the inferior olivarid nuclei or the tracts. So there's actually an extensive olivocerebellar tract which normally passes through the inferior olive at all parts of the cerebellum, and it's excited in the olive fiber from the cerebral motor. So it also has an input from other areas. Our local input, the one that we discussed, we've just discussed an input from the red nuclear of the midbrain, but it can also be fed by signals from the cerebral motor cortex, basal ganglia, some widespread area of the reticular formation from the spinal cord, so that it eventually feeds our cerebellum. So we can also get nucleus signals from the vestibular part. Remember the medulla oblongata also have the vestibular nuclei. So we can have signal from the vestibular nuclei. So these are normally regarded as the vestibulocerebellar fibers. So some of which originate from the vestibular apparatus itself. Vestibular apparatus is in the cerebellum, and thus others from the brainstem, the vestibular nuclei, which will eventually terminate into the flocculonodular that is the flocculonodular lobe and the vestigial nucleus of the cerebellum. So remember, this zone, we regarded this as the vestibulocerebellum zone of the cerebellum, the functional zone, that is majorly having the flocculonodular lobe and some part of the adjacent part of the vermis. Another signal will be from the specifically reticular area of the brain. So these are normally via the reticulocerebellar fibers. So we'll just be able to see that in the image just shortly. Normally terminates in the midline cerebellar areas, mainly in the vermis. So we can also have some incoming signals, not necessarily within the brain, but from a distant part or from the peripheral part. Those that emanates from the spinal cord and those that emanates from within the cranial areas. We having the dorsal spinal or the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Remember the importance of this in the transmission of the sensorial modalities, specifically the proprioceptions. We also have the spino-reticular pathway and also the spino-olivary pathway, sending information into the cerebellum. So we can just have a fair demonstration of it. So if you expand it a little bit so that we are able to see the fibers, this actually demonstrates the mid sagittal region of our cerebellum. So we are able to see the incoming fibers as we've demonstrated. So I think we are able to see the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, the ventral and spinocerebellar tract get having access or gaining entry into the cerebellum, some using the inferior part, some using the superior part. So remember the collections of these fibers as they enter into the cerebellum, it's normally referred to as the peduncle. So the same peduncle we can actually demonstrate in our model over here. So here we can see the superior cerebellar peduncle represented by a cartoonish image here, meaning that it allows for the entry of many nerve fibers or nerve tracts. So just our peduncle over there, the superior cerebellar peduncle, and we also have the middle one, as we are able to see the middle cerebellar peduncle. Meaning that this is how signal are able to gain or rather gain entry into the cerebellum, and we are also able to see the inferior part. So this also representing a group of fibers as they gain entry into our cerebellum. So as a continuation, it is important to note that each time an input signal arrives in the cerebellum, it actually divides and goes into two directions, one directly on the cerebellar deep nuclei to the corresponding area of the cerebral cortex overlying the deep nucleus. So it is also worth to note that we also suggested that the cerebellum also has the gray matter on the exterior part, and if you advance internally, you anticipate some so maybe to demonstrate the gray area, as you advance inside, you anticipate white matter. So as signals advance into the cerebellum, some move into the deeper area where we expect some nuclei, and some move into the corresponding cortex. So our white matter represented by this part, you can see it label the F. So normally arranged in some form of tree. So it has a name by the name arbor vitae. So that means we are having cell bodies over here in the cortex, and the tracts inside this arbor vitae, of course, joining through the peduncle, as we've just been able to demonstrate. And in the deep area, we also anticipate some nucleus, only that in this image, we are not able to see those famous nuclei, the dentate, and also the vestigial, and also some other that we'll be able to see. So all the deep cerebellar nuclei receive signal from two sources, the cerebellar cortex, and also the deep sensory afferent tracts to the cerebellum. So that at the end of the day, we saw some going to the nucleus. So the nuclei at the end of the day will receive signal. So let's just assume this is a nuclei just for fair demonstration. And this is our cerebellum. And at the outermost part becomes the cortex. So we said that as signal enters, some goes to the nuclei and some goes to the cortex. But when your reference points become the nucleus, we can see it receiving signals from the afferent fibers, sensory fibers, gaining access into the cerebellum, goes straight into the nuclei. They can also receive some of the signals back from the cortex into this particular area. So they're actually being supplied by the two. So from the nuclei, we anticipate now the cerebellum to sprout out some nerve fibers, so that they represent now the output. So the output signal from the cerebellum, of course, are expected to come from the various nuclei that we anticipate to be there at the cerebellum, and this include the deep located nuclei that we anticipate in the cerebellum mass. So this include the dentate that we were able to associate it somehow with the lateral zone or hemisphere, the interposed nuclei, and we also have the vestigial nuclei. So let's just track the movement that we anticipate. So a pathway that originates in the midline structure of the cerebellum, that is the vermis, then passes through the vestigial nuclei. So we've said that the nuclei will, in as much as it's receiving the input from the afferent sensory fibers, it will also receive those from the cortex. So specifically, the vestigial will receive from the cortical region of the vermis, and then passes to the vestigial nuclei. And then from the vestigial nuclei, it goes to the medullary and the pontine regions of the brain, as we are able to demonstrate while covering the functional region of the cerebellum. A pathway that originates in the intermediate zone, so this is another nuclei. In the intermediate zone, normally passes through the interposed nucleus, that is the interposed nucleus within the cerebellum, and then sprouts out these signals to the thalamus, specifically through the ventrolateral and the ventroarterial nuclei of the thalamus, then to the cerebral cortex. So remember, with what we talked of in terms of the spinocerebellum. So the signals need to go back to the cortex majorly for the correction. We saw that if the signals are not matching, some will need to go to the cerebral cortex for reconciliation, and then back again to this particular area for the motor control, specifically to the spinocerebellar region. Several medulla to the cortex and to the several medulla structure of the thalamus, then to the basal ganglia, to the red nucleus, reticular formation of the upper brainstem, and then a pathway that begins in the cerebellar cortex of the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere, then passes to the dentate, then next to the ventrolateral and the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and then finally to the cerebral cortex. So remember, these were more of planning, while these are some of the proprioception signal. So this is actually demonstrating how the nuclei are able to sprout out some of the fibers. So this, the other one was with the input. So this one is majorly the output from the dentate, some signal spreading to the pontine, and from the pontine to the thalamus and to the cortical region. So this representing the reverse of the famous pontine cerebellar pathway. So this is the opposite, the reverse of it, thalamocortical, from the cerebellar thalamus and into the cortical, or sometimes we say that some might pass through the red nucleus so that it gets into the thalamus. The vestigial will also sprout out, and also the interposed nuclei will also sprout out some signal. And eventually, this is what we anticipate as the normal function of the cerebellum in the overall motor control, and their role is actually in the, and maybe you can summarize their role as follows. The vestibulocerebellum part, this consists principally of the small folliculonodular cerebellar lobe that lies in the posterior cerebellum and adjacent portion of the vermis. This normally provides the neural circuit for the most body equilibrium movement. We also have the spinocerebellum. This consists most of the vermis of the posterior and the anterior cerebellum, plus the adjacent intermediate zone on both sides of the vermis. It normally provides the circuits for coordinating many movements of the distal portion of the limbs, especially the hands and the finger. We also have the cerebellum, normally consists of the large lateral zones of the cerebellum hemisphere, lateral to the intermediate zone. It receives virtually all its input from the cerebral motor cortex, as we demonstrated, and adjacent premotor and some part of the somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum, that is. It then transits its output information to the upward direction back to the brain, functioning in a feedback manner with the cerebral cortex sensory motor system to plan the sequential voluntary body and the limb movement. Planning of this as much as tens of seconds in advance before we actually get an actual movement. So this is called the development of the motor imagery movement to be performed. So this is the exact role of the cerebellum in the motor. So this becomes the fair end of our motor wing of the nervous system. So let's integrate the sensory, the motor, and see how everything works. So let's stop it at this spot.